Korean literature is where it all started for me, for both of us. Pictured Jess, not here. In the year between living in China and living in South Korea, we lived in the UK, and during that time, The Vegetarian came out in English. The Vegetarian is a novel by Han Kang, translated by Deborah Smith. Deborah Smith is a Korean to English translator who also owns the indie publication Tilted Axis Press. And when Han Kang and Deborah Smith were awarded the International Booker Prize, everyone paid attention. And this led me to read The Vegetarian and Human Acts, and once I'd moved to Seoul, shortly afterwards, a third book by Han Kang, translated by Deborah Smith, came out, The White Book. I'm going to talk about all three of these, but this is where it started for me, the world of literature in translation. So, let's talk about the best Korean novels available in English, the translators who do the work, the incredible authors, and what Korean literature means. Korean literature is awesome, and it feels like it keeps getting more and more awesome. 2020 was an especially good year for Korean literature and translation. Bear in mind, everything that I say is tinged with the fact that I'm talking about it in translation. There's only so much Korean literature available in English for us to read, and it's these incredible translators who do so much of the work, and I'm going to talk about them as much as I can. To start with, let's look at Kim Ji-young, born 1982, written by Cho Nam-ju and translated by Jamie Chang. Kim Ji-young, born 1982, is a Korean novel that has also been adapted to the screen, and it has received a lot of hatred around the world for being an intensely honest and feminist book. Kim Ji-young, born 1982, is a book about the titular Kim Ji-young. This name was chosen in the same way that Akira was chosen for the manga and film Akira, because Kim Ji-young is a very ordinary name in Korea, and it's the idea that Kim Ji-young could be anyone, any Korean woman. And that's kind of what the book is. It is the novelization of the unfortunately ordinary, everyday misogyny that women come up against, specifically for this book, in Korea. In that sense, the titular Kim Ji-young, our protagonist, is not so much a person. She's not a fully fleshed out character. She's a representation of abuse and misogyny and the unfairness of sexism in modern-day Korea. Kim Ji-young, as the title suggests, was born in 1982, and the novel tracks her life. It's framed by a therapist talking to her at the beginning and the end of the book. The therapist is a man and comes to his own conclusions about the state of her life and the state of her mind. And then throughout the middle, the meat of the book, we follow her life, her schooling, her job applications, her work, her relationships, her marriage, her responsibilities as a woman. It is a deconstruction of sexism and misogyny within Korean society, and of course within world society, within every society. It's an illuminating book, and because it is very much allegorical, it certainly lacks a little bit of the flair, I guess, the character arc of a novel, because it's not really one woman's story, it is every woman's story, and so it has to be broad in its scope, and it certainly does what it sets out to do. Let's talk about some genre fiction. Unfortunately, at the time of recording, genre fiction in translation from Korea is desperately lacking. We don't have a lot of Korean fantasy, Korean science fiction, Korean crime and mystery stories. We want more of it, and it's coming. I know some of it is coming, and I'm excited for it. But right now, The Plotters by Eun-soo Kim and translated by Sora Kim Russell, she's incredible. She translates so much Korean literature, and she is so damn good at it. We've interviewed her. I follow her every word on Twitter. She's awesome. So Sora Kim Russell, if a book is translated by her, read it. She does a stellar job. The Plotters by Eun-soo Kim is a piece of genre fiction that is still intensely literary. It is a book about an assassin, and it is set at the edge of democratization of South Korea. After the Korean War, Korea was just cut, right, across the middle into North Korea and South Korea. What a lot of people forget is the fact that after the Korean War, for several decades, South Korea was under a dictatorial thumb as well, and it was in 1985, I think, that Korea finally unlocked democracy. if you like. And this book is set at that time, and it follows an assassin. This assassin lives and works out of a library in Seoul. He is mentored by this strange old man. And it's a lot of fun, The Plotters. It's a great, fun romp. It's quite dense, but it feels lighthearted. It has a feathery kind of a weight to it, and it moves at a really nice click. But it is fun in the sense that it's about assassination, so it feels like a crime novel, but it's also intensely political because it does talk about the Korean War. It talks about the North-South divide. It talks about Korea fighting for its democracy. So there is a lot of actual historical politics going on, but at the same time, it is a really fun piece of genre fiction. So I really recommend The Plotters. I don't think enough people talk about it now. It's not even that old. It came, it was very, very exciting, and then it kind of went. So read it if you haven't. Plotters. It's great. I'm going to pause really, really quick just to talk about names. This is a frustrating thing when it comes to translation. If you read a lot of Japanese literature, you'll probably know that it is a very, very ordinary and well-established thing in the publishing industry that Japanese names traditionally go family name and then your first personal name. When we translate these novels, we change the author's name and all the characters' names to westernize them so that it goes your first name and then your last name. Example, Murakami Haruki becomes Haruki Murakami. A very ordinary thing to do. With Korean literature, different publishers, translators, I'm not sure who's in charge of this, but we change our minds constantly. And so some of the authors that I mention, I will name them in the Western way, and sometimes I'll name them in the Korean way, and I'm really just going off how their name appears in the book, on the cover, etc, etc. Case in point, my next author is Kyung-Suk Shin, or Shin Kyung-Suk. Depends who you ask, it depends what book you read and what publisher published it, etc, etc. I really think when it comes to Korean, Chinese and Japanese authors, we should just do it their way. No one can agree on it and it's very frustrating, and I don't even know who should be allowed to decide. Who's in charge of that decision? I don't know. Mini rant over, let's talk about Shin Kyung-Suk / Kyung-Suk Shin. So Kyung-Suk Shin is a wonderful author. She has written several fantastic novels. Please Look After Mum is a really intensely gorgeous family drama. It was a book that took her, I think, 10 years to write. She also wrote The Girl Who Wrote Loneliness and The Court Dancer. And The Court Dancer is the one I'm going to talk about. The Court Dancer was translated by Anton He, who is a dear friend of mine, an incredible translator. He's a powerful force within the Korean literary community. He's someone that I deeply, profoundly respect. And he translated The Court Dancer, so let's talk about that. The Court Dancer is I think at the time of recording, it is Kyung-Suk Shin's most recent book available in English, and it is based on a true story. Something you might have heard about with Korea is that it's sometimes referred to as a shrimp between whales, the whales being China and Japan, possibly Russia as well. And at the tail end of the 19th century, Korea was being closed in on from all sides. At this time, the Joseon dynasty, a French diplomat arrives in Seoul. His eye is caught by a court dancer. There's a pun there somewhere. And this court dancer is our protagonist. The French diplomat fell in love with her. He was captivated by her. We get to know her story, we get to know her childhood, we get to know her past, and it's a tragic and yet somehow uplifting story. And what we get then is a journey from Seoul to Paris. And this is in the late 19th century with this artistic, poetic renaissance going on in Paris. The book even mentions a few famous poets, painters, etc., who were very prominent in the literary scene in Paris at this time. There's a fantastic moment in the book where they go to a museum and they see some I think it's a statue, I can't remember. It's something Korean, something that's been taken. It's at this moment that our court dancer sort of understands that she is an exotic animal in the same way that zoo creatures are and museum pieces are. She sees something that belongs to her culture, and in France it's been put in a museum to be gawped at and admired as a piece of the scenery, as a piece of exoticism. And that's kind of what the book is about. It is, at least in part, about how the world sees itself, how the West sees the East, colonization. It's a wonderfully powerful book. beautifully translated, beautifully written, and a really tender story. And it's a love story, but it's also not at all. And it's fantastically political without the politics ever dragging you down or slowing the plot to make a specific point. Every political beat is poignant and delivered with just the right amount of tenderness, I guess. It's a really gorgeous book. So, yeah, read The Court Dancer. And read Please Look After Mum. And read The Girl Who Wrote Loneliness. Do that. A Korean author that everyone should be familiar with, and I don't mean you should be, I mean you should be familiar with, is Bae Soo-ah. Bae Soo-ah is a pretty prolific Korean author, and in English, I think all of her books, probably all, of her books are translated by the aforementioned Deborah Smith, who also translates Han Kang. Let's talk about Untold Night and Day. Untold Night and Day is a book that was released in early 2020 and features on my end of 2020 list. And it's a David Lynch inspired fever dream of a book. It follows a protagonist / narrator who used to be an actress and now she just works at a theatre. I think she just works at the ticket office or something. She's nearly 30 and she's entering a kind of life crisis. She realizes she's about to be out of a job and suddenly she has to go pick someone up from the airport. I think that's what happens. I actually can't quite remember. And the reason I can't quite remember is because this, as I said, is a fever dream. This is a 150-page, twisted, mangled journey of a book. It flits between narrators at one point. It takes us on a really strange journey through Seoul at a time where the heat is choking. There's this heat wave going on, and it is like the city has a fever. And it is a fever dream. It is as though Seoul is caught in a fever dream. Seoul has turned hot and sick, and our protagonist is at the heart of it. It's weird, but it's really exciting because it kind of represents crisis as we experience it, and that's really cool. It really feels kind of Twin Peaksy at times. It really feels Lynchian, and it is a fever dream. It is a strange, unnerving tale, and it really gets you. A book that was a bit of an underdog, I think, of 2020 is a book called Bee Book and Me. Bee Book and Me is one of my favourite books of 2020. It was written by Kim Sagwa and translated by Sun Hee Jung. It's awesome. Bee Book and Me, it has a kind of an anime feel to it, a coming of age / subtly surreal anime. Bee Book and Me is set in an unnamed coastal town in South Korea, a kind of a nowhere place. It is named after our three protagonists, Bee, Book, and a character called Rang, who is the me of the book, the kind of main protagonist, I suppose. The book starts off following Rang, who is just me, and it is her relationship with B and Book. B is Rang's best friend, and the two of them are going through high school, going through puberty, going through adolescence together, and Book is a book addict and book collector that they meet a little bit later on. And it is very much a kind of slice of life story, but there are some real surreal elements, and the surreal elements kind of come from the city itself and the nature of it. There's a fog of sorts that surrounds the city, and these three characters are going on adventures, meeting boys, discovering each other, exploring their relationships. It's a real slice of life coming of age drama, but it has a desperately sad tone to it because of this subtly surrealist feel that the town that they live in is a labyrinth, an unknowable entity, and it seems to represent the fact that they don't really know themselves or each other as well as they'd like to, and that's kind of what coming of age and growing up and going through adolescence means. It's a really great book. The cover is beautiful as well. Alright, now we get to my favourite Korean author in the world, probably one of my favourite authors full stop, and that is Pyeon Hye-young, or Hye-young Pyeon, depending on who's publishing, blah blah blah, we've been through this. Pyeon Hye-young is fucking awesome. She is a horror writer of a different sort. If you think you understand what horror means when you think of horror novels and horror films, etc., you don't. Not once you've read Pyeon Hye-young. So at the time of recording, she has 3 books out in English, all 3 of which are translated by Sora Kim Russell. One is The Hole, one is City of Ash and Red, and the third is called The Law of Lines. I'm going to talk about the first two in particular because I didn't actually love The Law of Lines. The Law of Lines is a family drama slash crime drama. It's not my usual fare, and it's not horror, really. It's twisted and unnerving in places, but it's not horror. Whereas The Whole, oh my god, okay, The Whole follows the story of a man who gets into a car crash, and he's an unwitting bit of a shit protagonist. He gets into a car crash, and the car crash kills his wife, and he wakes up and he is now paralyzed entirely. I think he can move his eyes, and as the book progresses he starts to be able to move his left hand a little bit. So slowly he is regaining control over his body, but he is trapped in his mind, he is trapped in his body, and he is subject to the will and control and power of his now late wife's mother. Our protagonist had nowhere else to go. He was put in the care of his mother-in-law, who leaves him in a bedroom to just lie there with nothing to do, obviously, and she is cold and she is strange and she is an uncomfortable guardian. And all the while, out in the garden, as he slowly realizes, she is digging a massive hole. And he doesn't know why, he doesn't know what the hole is for. It's horrifying. And the thing is, this book has nothing overtly scary in it. This is terror. This is not horror, this is terror. It is unsettling and frightening and intimidating. He is trapped within his own mind and body. He is perfectly aware of what's going on and has nothing that he can do about it. And all the while, this guardian who hates him for the fact that her daughter is now gone, and she doesn't really speak to him, she doesn't communicate with him, she just treats him a little bit horribly all the time, just horribly enough to piss you off, and she's digging a big-ass hole in the garden. It's freaky as fuck, and I love it. I love The Hole. I love it. It's one of my favourite books. Absolutely brilliant. Pyeong Hye-young is amazing. Read The Hole. I'm also going to talk about her other book that I absolutely adore, which is called City of Ash and Red. City of Ash and Red is set, not really clear where it is. It kind of seems like it's set between Korea and Japan, maybe. It's set in a city that's just called C. That's C. And I think our protagonist moves from Korea, I think it's supposed to be Japan, but it's not entirely clear. It might even be somewhere in Europe, but he definitely leaves Seoul to end up somewhere just called City C. And it is a Kafka-esque novel through and through, to the point that you would think that this was written by Kafka. You take someone who loves Kafka, you hand them this manuscript and say that it's a lost Kafka novel and they'll believe you. It is the Kafka-esque novel. If you love him, you'll love this. It is set in a city where everything is kind of slowly falling apart. There's trash in the streets, there's rats everywhere, and our protagonist is being just led in circles. He's been sent to this place to work by his company. He doesn't really understand the company. He doesn't know what his job is. He doesn't know why he's there. And he makes phone calls with ex-colleagues and employers and municipal people. He's trying to figure this shit out and he can't. And he's being just led around in circles. It really feels like a 21st century Kafkaesque novel. It is frustrating and aggravating on purpose, just like every Kafka story is. It's an absolute gem of a novel. I really adore these two books, The Whole and City of Ash and Red. The Whole got a lot of attention. I think a lot of people have read it. If you've read any Korean literature, The Whole is probably one of them. And if you haven't read City of Ash and Red, you need to do that as well. I've already mentioned Han Kang and translator Deborah Smith. So far, right now, they have 3 books available in English. Han Kang has written 3 novels, all 3 translated by Deborah Smith. One is Human Acts, another is The Vegetarian, which so many people have read because it won the International Booker Prize, and the third is The White Book. All 3 of these are uniquely brilliant and beautiful novels. The Vegetarian is a particularly surreal and strange book. I think because a lot of people have read The Vegetarian, a lot of people have read Human Acts, I want to talk a little bit about The White Book. When The White Book came out, I reviewed it, and I mentioned how it's really important that this book is read physically. I think reading a physical copy of The White Book is important. It's the story of a protagonist. I think that protagonist is supposed to be Han Kang herself. I haven't read this book in like 2 years, so. The protagonist travels to a Central European city, and in an interview, I'm pretty sure Han Kang makes clear that it's supposed to be Warsaw. In this city, our protagonist is sort of piecing together her memories and her past and her situation, but the book is defined by white objects. This is why it's important to read a physical copy of this book, is that Hong Kong took photos, black and white photos of white things, and it creates this just gorgeous synergy of writing and imagery. Every chapter is based around a white thing. It makes you consider whiteness. It makes you consider these objects, and most of all for me, it made me consider snow. I love winter. I love Christmas. And it just made me think about snow quite a lot. It was really lovely. For me at least, but it's not a particularly lovely book. It's sad. It's a really sad story, but it's interesting, this fusion of fragmented memories and fragmented present situation with specific objects which share only the theme of whiteness, and yet that whiteness, through a little bit of imagination, ingenuity, and beautiful imagery, allows you to create a cohesive connection, a thread that runs through all of these objects that inspire the entire narrative and find connections to the memories and the lived experiences of our protagonist. It's beautiful stuff. It really is. It is Hong Kong at her most experimental, even though her other two books are still really trippy and strange. This is a book that I think your average reader may not have read. A lot of people who read Korean literature will have read the other two, but they might not have read the White Book. For whatever reason, I don't think it seemed to get as much attention, so here's me giving it attention. Obviously, if you haven't read The Vegetarian and you haven't read Human Acts, you definitely should. I think of the two, I slightly prefer Human Acts because it's a little bit more heavily political. It's about war. It is about people being ravaged by warfare and the fallout and the aftermath of that. But anyway, if you haven't read The White Book, it really is a beautiful, beautiful piece of literature and imagery. So do that. All right, I've not talked about every Korean novel. I've not talked about every great Korean author. There are other books that I've left out, but these are ones that I think are real necessities. And some of them are a little bit underdog-ish, if you like. So let me know. Please tell me your favorite Korean author. Tell me your favorite Korean novel. Tell me which of these books you have read or want to read, etc. I actually want a conversation about this. I love Korean literature. Korean literature, as it exists in translation, led me to the job that I have. I have a lot to thank it for, and Korean literature continues to be wonderful. Also, a final shout out to the publishing house Honford Star. Honford Star are doing incredible things with literature in translation, and it started with Korean literature. So go to their website, check out Honford Star, check out the short story collections and old Korean literature from times and places that aren't given enough attention. All right, subscribe, like this if you like it, and don't if you don't. Bye. Love you.